This is Mehmet Polatel, and we. I'm actually the academic coordinator of the project that you've been hearing about today, and I work at the foundation. We were supposed to have four speakers, but sadly, Ümit Kurt could not make it due to ill health, and we have one online participant and two participants here, and all the talks will be delivered in Turkish. We will be talking about exile, return, and dispossession, which is one of the most important um, subjects in the history of Turkish Republic, and we are here to talk about different dimensions of these today. The first speaker will be Seda Altuğ, and Seda is actually my advisor for my thesis, and I'm honored to be in the same panel as her. She teaches at Boğaziçi University, and she focuses on modern Syria and the history of the Republic, and she completed his PhD in Utrecht University, and she focuses on colonization, violence, land, and memory. And she is also someone who has published countless articles, and today she's going to tell us about Syria, governing the cross-border region in Syria and imagining the Turkish nation in Turkey, 1921-39 is the title of her talk. Thank you very much. Likewise, I'm equally as honored to be here with a former student of mine. And I also would like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation for extending an invitation to us and for bringing us here together. Now, as the title of my talk implies, I will be talking about cross-border region in Syria, imagining the Turkish nation in Turkey. And since the morning sessions, and previously we talked about the minority policies in Turkey, the violence that it has engendered, and we have touched upon many important topics. But minorities, literature about minorities in Turkey are confined within the boundaries of the Republic of Turkey. But actually, cross borders, I mean, that's within the domain of, foreign relations or immigration studies, people tend to think. And I am going to change that paradigm, and I'm going to say something that is not necessarily mentioned all the time. The relation states established with their cross-border areas. And by the way, this is Turkey, and this is, I don't know if you can see it, but yes, 877 kilometers established in 21 between Derik and Nusaybin, this division, and Iskenderun. Apart from Iskenderun province, I mean, it was the same back in 21. It's almost the same. There have been certain amendments, such as the annexation of the Iskenderun province by Turkey, and between Derik and Nusaybin. And this is Syria, Lebanon, and this is from 38. This map, the Iskenderun province, it's within Syria at that time. And like I said, when we talk about the history of minorities in Turkey, we usually focus our attention within the boundaries of Turkey. But cross borders is not something that we discuss all the time. It's left to the remit perhaps of international relations, but immigration relations. But the relationship that states establish with their cross-border areas is also quite indicative, and the way how people live in these regions are governed is quite indicative of how minorities are treated within that country, especially when it comes to the post-colonial contexts. I mean, when we look at examples such as Israel and India, we can also see reflections of this. Now, we also see that there is a link here, right? These countries, I mean, policies geared towards the minorities, they're not limited to the practices within nation states, and also there are other considerations. In my presentation, I will talk about nation building within Turkey and without, especially the Syrian border, which is around here, this region here, And I'm going to try and give you some insights. Since 2012, when the Arab Spring first started, in the mainstream media in Turkey, names of certain cities in Syria or the maps of these areas, they became visible to a certain extent. But for 100 years, in terms of cartography, we have had some standardization, but and there were some spelling errors as well in these maps, and they were not fully developed maps, and they were reminiscent of the maps in the 30s in the Turkish press. Syria was under French mandate at the time, and the Kurdish, Caledonian areas in Syria at the time. I mean, there were some images, and I'd like to show you three examples from the 30s Turkish media about Syria, where maps were shared in the press. One of these, actually, there were three uprisings. One took place in Turkey, actually, and it was organized in Syria. This is the Araras uprising back in 1930, and in the northeastern part of Syria, Cezire Bilhet in Kurdish, because it means below the line, below the rail line, Baghdad railway. So the Jazira, it's an autonomous province. There was an uprising there back in 1936, and the reason for this, as I said previously, was because integration with the. I mean, they didn't want to integrate with Syria. They wanted to remain autonomous. That was the bone of contention that resulted in this uprising, which ultimately failed, and Cezire became no longer autonomous. And the third incident, the third uprising, actually, just like the one in Cezire, it was concurrently happening, and the causes were the same, and that's the clashes in Iskenderun province. And in Turkey, in our curriculum, we call this the Hatay question. But actually, this was akin to what was happening in Cezire, just like the Cezire uprising in the Iskenderun province or Sancak. To the west of the border, there were clashes. Certain quarters didn't want to integrate with Syria, and they wanted to remain autonomous. And in Cezire, and also in Iskenderun, just like the Alevi Sancaks, the Jebel Duruz, and the Alevi Sancak on the shore, this was autonomously governed in 36. Between Arab nationalists and France, there was an agreement. 5 years later, Syria would be independent. Damascus would be the capital. They agreed, and these autonomous areas did not want to be a part of Syria. However, at the end of these agreements in July 39, the French gave up on the idea, and the negotiations came to a halt, and the independent Syrian project was postponed to 46. Independent Syrian project, despite this postponement, one of the Sancaks of Syria, Iskenderun, or after 38, as Emrecan Dağlıoğlu indicated, it was called Hatay. So this city was actually given to Turkey as a result of an agreement between Paris and Ankara, and this obviously created a furore in Syria, especially non-Turk and Muslim populations were devastated, and they had to flee their land, their homeland, and Arabs, Sunnites, increased in numbers in certain areas, and the ghosts of the Armenian genocide were still very much intact. So there were, all of these sentiments in the region, and many people had to flee their homeland. So seemingly, I mean, this was an alteration of the border, and this was an agreement between the states. But actually, these historic moments, when we delve deep into it, we realize that the drawing of the external boundaries are not a force unto themselves. They're very much in parallel with the nation-making processes, internal processes. To put it in other way, this project of Turkification actually doesn't stop at the borders. To the contrary, I mean, when it comes to the drawing of the borders, when it comes to the meaning attached to these borders, we see that these are very much shaped by the Turkification process within Turkey. The Iskenderun province, plus the Cezire Sancak people living in these regions, their social identities, religious identities also support this proposition. In the Cezire region, people living there, a vast majority of them were either dissidents of the Kemalist regime, they were politically engaged people, or they were disenfranchised, dispossessed, poor people, or people who deserted the army, Turkish army, Caledonians, and so between 15 and 40, they lived in this area. And they were victims of the official powers that be in Turkey. Now, the autonomy movement in Cezire, apart from the Hatay question in Syria and Turkey, the border question in the 30s and 40s was not covered, but the border discussion has always been a part of intelligence reports back in 20s and 30s, and in my presentation I will look at these reports, but before that let me tell you who lived in these areas, and let me also tell you why people fled Turkey and settled in Syria. Now, actually, here's what we know. I mean, the biggest wave of migration was after the genocide. In terms of numbers, it was quite large, but the other two waves to Lebanon and Syria should not be overlooked. And these are this one is one before the Kilikia War that took place in 21. When Turkey received Adana, and right afterwards, as per Ankara Agreement, the Turkey-Syria border was established in the year 1921. This gave way to large waves of immigration. And the third large wave of immigration was right after the Sheikh Said uprising in 25, and right afterwards. So, forceful displacements in Kilikia. These people lived in Adana, Marash. These were Orthodox Armenians, or from Urfa, they were Syriac people. And these people either went to Iskenderun, part of Syria, or the Syrian side of the Turkey-Syria border, or in refugee camps up north in Syria. And the third wave is the Sheikh Said uprising, like I said, and in terms of destination, in terms of components, this was different than the previous waves of immigration. At the base of the third wave, you have the Sheikh Said uprising and the Turkish state. And Iraq was under British rule at the time, so they had this Royal Air Forces that they deployed to quash the uprising. And from Mardin, Midyat, Syria, from Turabdin, from Eruh, Nusaybin, Silvan, and Beşeri, Garzan, and even Diyarbakır and Batman, people, Armenians, Syriacs, Caledonians, and Jews actually went to Cezire in Syria. They had to move towards that region, and this was the last non-Muslim immigration in the newly established Republic of Turkey. And in 1915, obviously after 1915, there were survivors, and many of these people were survivors of the genocide. They were protected by the Kurdish tribes. They lived for decades, but after the Sheikh Said uprising, they had to because of the uprising, they had to flee. They were compelled to flee with their Kurdish compatriots or neighbors. They went to the French Jazeera, crossed over the border to the French Jazeera, and this actually um, took place until the 50s due to economic reasons. There were seasonal waves of migration as well. So Lebanon and Syria, under the French mandate, attracted people from Turkey. Those who were not wanted had to flee Turkey, and they are actually a microcosm, a reflection of what was happening in Turkey at the time. So my time is limited, so I'm not really going to go into the details of these debates in Syria, Lebanon, refugee placement programs, camps, citizenship. I mean, I am not going to talk about all of these things, or the relations between the local populations and immigrants. Armenians received citizenship in Syria, and Kurds, their citizenship was not so easy, it was not so fast. So let me also tell you about the administration of the borders, shall I? And how that pertains to minorities in these countries. And maybe we can entertain your questions as well at the end. So the drawing of the border, drawing of the lines is actually quite interesting in and of itself. We need to look at this from this historical context, and also look at how it was enforced. People living around the borders, how they were made to toe the line, and how the continuity of the border was achieved, and who was protected against whom, with what tools, with what methodology. This is important. The security, for the security of the border, every 15 days, in one of the provinces or towns, administrative staff would get together for a summit, and you have minutes of these meetings as well. I was able to look at these minutes, and I mean, they are quite illuminating as well. In these meetings, there are certain things that are discussed repeatedly. The crossing of the border, which represents the sovereignty of the state, permeability of the border, the French officers on the Syrian side, their arbitrariness, and the Turkish state's interests, and how these are sometimes disrespected. In every meeting, you have these mentioned. At every meeting, violations of the borders are laid down in a detailed fashion. Many names are cited in these minutes. Names of thefts, names of the indebted, what was smuggled, animals smuggled, wheat, other goods and merchandise. And on the Turkish side, the list is actually quite long, much longer than the French side or the Syrian side's list. And every 15 days, like I said, they convene and they look at what was discussed the last time they got together, and they talk about the hot topics on the agenda. And if there's an outbreak of violence, there are two versions of the story between the French side and the Turkish side. There are always discrepancies between these two accounts. In these minutes, also you see that those who violate, there are certain gangs and persons violating the border, and thus endangering sovereignty of the Turkish state. They come in two sorts. One, Turkish citizens who sought refuge in Syria, mainly Kurds and some Syriacs and some common criminals or gangs. This is how they're called, what they're called. And these people endanger the security of the borders, so they are to be expelled from the border area. This is what is expected. These common criminals should not reside in villages on the border. If that is the case, then they can seek revenge from their Turkish compatriots. That's the allegation. So they're asked to be expelled. And the second group is actually entirely different than the first group. These are what they call the unwanted, the political exiles. These are pro-Kurdish nationals, sheiks, tashnaks, and members of the Huygun organization, and those who are in a similar situation. So these people are also living around the border, Turkey says. These people undermine the security of not just the borders, but the entire country, so they should be expelled 50 kilometers away from the borders. And similarly, Armenians, just because they're Armenian, should not be serving as army officers. And many Armenians then change their names as a result after this request from Turkey. Between these two groups, there's a marked difference, of course. And these people, when it comes to the ethnicity of these people, the unwanted, yes, Taşnuk, Huygun members, and so on and so forth. But the common criminals in the first category, sometimes they're asked to be expatriated to Turkey, but they're not wanted either, because they hear that the French administration is distributing land in Algiers. That's why they cross the border. Some cross the border because of vendettas. Some flee the army, and some smuggle goods, traffic goods, and some of them are dissidents. So there are people who are being suspected. And as such, these two categories start to overlap after a certain while in the documents. And on top of that, on both sides of the border, there are people who reside on these both sides, and they have propensity to be political dissidents. And this is an intermediary category, which is very inclusive, and this is actually reminiscent of the political atmosphere in the 30s. So there's a lot of overlap between these different categories, but the lines are very much blurred. So when you look at the minutes of these meetings, when you look at these lists, you see exhaustive lists full of names, mainly composed of Kurds and also Syriacs. Armenians are very rare on the Turkish side of the border. Obviously, they don't really cross over to Turkey either from the Syrian side. Yes, in the 20s, right below the southern border of Turkey, again, one of the unwanted group of unwanted people, that there's a concern in Turkey that there's a pocket full of dissidents here. Christians who fled the genocide, or Kurds, dissident Kurds, are filling up this pocket. Turkey thought, and this would be a source of threat for Turkey between 25-27. Between Damascus, Paris, and Ankara, in the intelligence reports, you see this, and in the high-level telegrams, you also see this being mentioned. These cross-border Kurds, their mobility in this area, and the fact that there are also Armenians around the borders, and also the fact that there are people coming and going back and forth. And in 1930, Turkey's worst fears come true, and there's an uprising in Ağrı in 1930. After the Ağrı uprising, managing what's going on across the borders becomes a huge priority for Turkey in the 30s. Just like Yeşim said in the morning, in Syria and Lebanon, there's this huge debate on minorities, and any constitutional discussions, and Turkey is interested in this, whether people going from Turkey would be recognized as minorities, whether they'd be under protection under the constitution. And then after 36, in the Sancak of Cezire, there's an autonomy movement and the whole issue about İskenderun. So this also gains prominence, and Emrecan Dağlıoğlu also told us about this. There are all sorts of allegations, allegations of negligence, this and that. So these are hotly debated. But before the Second World War, regional geopolitical order is reshaped, and Turkey has the upper end in the end. So, pro-France Kurds are suppressed in the Jazira area, and in Iskenderun, obviously, that is annexed by Turkey. So that's the uh, that's the story. This comes to an end in 39, and Syria becomes independent as well.
So when there was homogeneity earlier, because of being partitioned into two sectors, it brought along political and emotional consequences. So this is a border that is emotionally charged. So this also serves as a shield for dissidents. So dissidents could actually flee Turkey through crossing that border. And it also provided very important socio-economic opportunities. So this permeability of border, this has always been an issue of discussion and even harsh negotiation between administrative authorities. Who would be allowed to cross the border? Who would be allowed to visit their relatives on the other side of the border? Who would be able to do cross-border trade? So this has always been identified based on political dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier on, the ethnic and religious hierarchies existing in Turkey were somehow navigated through these intersectionalities. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Çok teşekkürler Seda. Şimdi ikinci konuşmacımızı tanıtmak istiyorum. Elif Kevser Özer. Kendisi Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Türk Dili ve Edebiyatı bölümünde lisans derecesini aldı.
And now we will turn to our next speaker who completed the studies at University of Şehir University, worked in Sulukule and the impact of urban transformation in Sulukule, and right now continuing PhD studies at Boğaziçi University, and will tell us more about the expulsion of Istanbul Greeks in 1964. So we will now turn to Elif Kevser Özer, and her paper is titled I Remember Apelasis as It Was Yesterday.
Başa dönemiyorum. Döndüm sanırım.
Tamam. Çok teşekkürler. 20 dakikanız var.
You have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this conference and everyone for their efforts. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us today. I will be talking about the deportation of Greek citizens of Istanbul in 1964 and 65. This is not a subject that has been studied extensively, but it marks a very important historical period in the history of modern Turkey, because the deportation of Greek citizens resulted in the mass migration of Greeks of Istanbul. And Istanbul Greeks define this period as Apelasis. The Turkish meaning of Apelasis is to be exiled or expelled. More specifically, in a political context, Apelasis refers to the deportation of Istanbul Greeks, in other words, the 1964 exile. But who are the Greek citizens of Istanbul? So those are the Greek citizens who had to leave the country in 1964-65. They actually settled in Istanbul before 1918. and they were called etabli, established Greek passport holders, and their children and their grandchildren. So why were they expelled in 1964? First of all, I should point out that the Greeks of Istanbul were not deported for the first time in 1964. Even before 64, Greeks who criticized government policies and were somewhat caught on attention by the state, they were being deported. For instance, Kaloumenos, who photographed the pogrom of September 6 and 7, pogrom of 55, he was already expelled. But we also know that there were about 51 Greek citizens who were deported between 57 and 63. But what makes the year 64 so peculiar is it is the time when there was a mass deportation of Greek citizens. And of course there are certain elements and circumstances. Of course the Cyprus question comes to the fore. So at the end of 63, the independent Republic of Cyprus comes to an end de facto due to intercommunal conflicts in Cyprus, and Turkey, being one of the guarantor countries of the Republic of Cyprus, deported Greek citizens to bring Greece, another guarantor country, to the negotiation table. So this is a very common explanation that we hear very often, and it's of course true to some extent, but it is incomplete. Because the exile of 64 is a nation-state reflex implemented against a group seen as an exchange exception. So they were exempted from the exchange of population. And this is problematic because this reflex is quite important, and if we just miss it, it will also overshadow this reflex. So the Cyprus crisis should be seen as a crack that allowed this reflex that already existed. So on March 16th, 1964, the Turkish government terminated the 1930 agreement on residence and trade, and as a result, for Greek citizens, termination of this agreement, suspension of their title deeds. There were a number of economic sanctions against Greek citizens, and according to the provisions of this agreement, Greek citizens were given a 6-month period to leave Turkey, but actually, without even waiting for the 6-month period, 1,100 people were deported.
Felçli ihtiyarların olması ve listelerde.
And by the way, the fact that there were disabled people and paralyzed elderly people among those deported made those actions questionable, in a way causing a legitimacy problem. In 1955, the visa exemption agreement signed between Turkey and Greece was cancelled. Therefore, Greek citizens who were residing in Istanbul but who went to visit Greece for the Easter, they could never come back to Turkey. So there was an increasing number of Greek citizens who were being deported, and this culminated in 1964. So, as of mid-September 1964, the practice of deportation on charges of harmful activity ended. However, Greek citizens whose residency permits were not renewed and therefore had to leave Turkey, they continued to leave the country in groups, and this situation continued till the beginning of 1966. Approximately 12,500 people were deported, and more than 30,000 people had to leave Istanbul in such a short time. So this historical period is seen today as the beginning of the extinction of Istanbul's Greek community. So the Greek community could actually live as a community outside Istanbul and outside Turkey. As part of my PhD study, I did a field work, and I would like to share with you some findings. Between 2022 to 2023, I held oral history interviews in Athens and Thessaloniki, and I will be sharing with you some of the narratives. These are the narratives of deported people and their accompanying relatives. So it is the very first oral history research focusing on the 1964 deportation. As part of this research, I met a total of 80 people in one-on-one interviews. I also went through their personal documents, family photographs, passports, court minutes, and work permits. So I could also come up with an archive. I'm well aware that time is quite limited, but let me now focus on the experiences of Greeks from Istanbul during the exile and post-exile period. By the way, I will only be using pseudonyms for my interviewees. So Greek citizens learned that they were going to be deported either by receiving a notification from police officers or from their acquaintances or from the lists of people to be deported that was published in the newspaper. And according to the standard deportation procedure, those who received the notification were summoned to the police headquarters in Sirkeci. They would then be providing their fingerprints, their photographs would be taken, their height measurement would be done, they would undergo an overall health examination, and at the end they would sign some declarations, statements, and the statement included a number of elements: that they were leaving Turkey voluntarily, that they themselves violated money protection laws, that they themselves were members of Eliniki organization that was actually closed down in late 50s, and that they also donated funds to EOKA organization in Cyprus. So people who were deported did not have the chance to say goodbye to their loved ones, and very shortly they were deported, accompanied only by police officers. But in case these deportees could provide a Turkish sponsor, then they were given a 1 week time before their deportation, and they were also allowed to take some items with them. When Greek citizens of Istanbul learned that they were in the deportation list, they tried to develop some strategies in order not to be deported. That includes applying to Turkish citizenship, or getting married to a Turkish citizen, or converting to another religion or denomination. So here on this slide you see a campaign, and this is a petition from this campaign for the painter Ivi Stangali, so that he could stay in Istanbul. So through their influential acquaintances, they try also to cancel the deportation order. But during my field research, I could only find one person who could be saved from deportation the last minute. And that was thanks to prominent family members who had connections, and they had to pay a large amount of bribe to escape immediate deportation. Another measure was freezing the bank account of Greek citizens of Istanbul, and the official authorities seized the belongings of their homes and workplaces and transferred all the money generated from the seizure to the treasury. One of the interviewees, Dimitra, said that after her father was deported, officials from the Ministry of Finance came to their home and listed all his belongings, except the sewing machine his father bought for Dimitra, because this was not really included in the confiscated items, because Dimitra's name was written on the invoice for the machine. And today Dimitra still keeps that sewing machine at her home in Thessaloniki. In another case, Statis remembers that the machines awaiting repairs in his father's shop, they were also listed by finance officers, even though they were owned by third parties. And although it was forbidden to take the machines out of the shop, Statis, who was only 18 years old when his father was deported, he took a great risk and returned all machines to their owners so that no one would suffer because of that situation. Another interviewee, Akis, explained how, after the finance officers recorded all the belongings in the house, they looted the furniture from the neighbor's family house, because they were saying that they would be taken away anyway by the authorities, so why don't we replace and swap our furniture? So the family could not really intervene, and their home was effectively looted by the neighbors. And Akis found a rocking chair, which is the only relic from his childhood. So this is a photograph by another interviewee. These are some items. You can see some teaspoons, and they could actually hide this in their shoes, and this is how they brought them to Greece. So after 64, Greeks had to leave Istanbul because their residence permits were no longer reviewed. And yet they were allowed to take some of their belongings with them. I'm saying some because in certain cases, for instance, a silver mirror or a certain rug or carpet cannot really cross the border, or they would just disappear in the meanwhile. Here on the screen you see a passport. There are some notes. These notes are about the belongings this person had, so they could give the belongings to customs, and later on they could get the belongings only after 6 months in Athens, and this is all registered in the passport. And another interviewee, Ivis Tangali, the artist, he had to take out his original paintings from their frames, and together with his mentor, Bedirahmi Eyüpoğlu, they would take the entire portfolio to Sirkeci, giving them to the Sirkeci train station chief, but Ivis Tangali could never take his own paintings back. And throughout his life, he sent petitions to each and every possible authority in Greece and elsewhere. He was one of the prominent artists, painters of the time, a very prominent painter, Ivis Tangali, but he could not keep any of his own paintings. And he couldn't also take his paints with him, and when he was in Greece he could not really afford to buy new paint either. So the lists of deportees were published extensively in newspapers. For weeks, even months, Greeks had to meticulously check those lists. They were looking for the names of their own relatives, so they were always living in fear of deportation. So they were exposed to psychological torture for a very long period of time. For instance, when Dora, one of the interviewees, when she learns that her father would be deported, she actually sighs an omen of relief. That was a sigh of relief for her, because all this uncertainty was too much to bear, because they knew that they're all Greek citizens and they will ultimately be deported. Another interview is Dimitri. They decided to leave Istanbul in May 1964. And Dimitri's father, Nico, he was the owner of one of the largest stores in Istanbul in Karaköy. They sold all their goods to a neighbor, of course, at a price far below their value. And they tried to take this money to Athens. They also want to take the items to Athens, but because a neighbor reports about this, they had to sell them at a very low price. So here on this slide, you see the diary of Nico. He tells about his forced deportation all the way from Istanbul to Syria, from Syria to Lebanon, and ultimately from Lebanon to Athens. So this was a very long journey, forced deportation, and he could only afford buying a car, a second-hand old car, with the money that he could take away with him, and started a business from scratch by selling fabric across the villages in Athens. Here on this slide, there is another example. Evie, a young woman at the time, she was subjected to strip search at the airport and at the customs. And Polatel, another interviewee, upon the request of his mother, who was in Athens for an Easter visit, she actually took a dinner set with her, inherited from the grandmother. So he takes this dinner set as a souvenir, but then at the train station, custom officers tell him that he cannot take these dinner set or plates out of the border because these are antique plates. So he ends up paying a lot of bribe. So he already loses the money that he was allowed to take with him. And when he reaches Athens, he found himself in Canningo Square with empty plates in his hands, but not a penny in his pocket. So the most difficult moments in the interviews were when people talked about the first days of their lives in Greece. The narratives constantly revolved around the themes of poverty, deprivation, loneliness, lack of support, longing for Istanbul, and despair. So this was tantamount to having a lower profile in their new country, and of course this required constant struggle to build their lives from scratch. For instance, Rissi said that his father, who was in his 60s, had to accept any job he was offered to without hesitation because they were in need of money. And he said that after he started working as a car washer in his hometown, Skaramaga, his father actually attempted suicide at the port of Piraeus because he really thought that this was not a decent job for him. There are also some witness accounts and narratives about people who committed suicide or people who suffered from early deaths due to cancer diseases and heart attacks. Those who had relatives in the places they went to started working in various jobs to keep their obligatory stay as short as possible. But then those housewives, mothers, who would not really work in Istanbul, whose work would actually be considered shameful in Istanbul, they were obliged to start working in Greece after the exile, and this made women even more vulnerable. Some of the interviewees also said they had to work while studying, they had to live on very low incomes, and that they tried much harder than their peers to finish their education early and get a job. Other interviews mentioned that upon arrival in Athens, it was easier for them to find a job due to their higher level of education. But I have to say that this group remains in minority. Another interviewee, Polatel, this was actually a meeting point for Greek citizens of Istanbul, Greek citizen Istanbulites, because this was actually a bus stop. This was the last stop of Istanbul buses in Athens. And Vatis later on opened a taverna. This also became a gathering place for Greeks from Istanbul. And since the mid-60s, the construction industry in Athens was experiencing rapid growth due to the occupation and post-war reconstruction, and this opened new opportunities for Greeks from Istanbul. And those who had previous experience in Istanbul, in masonry, in craftsmanship, they were able to work. When we look into the practices of the Greek government, it is quite difficult to say that the Greek government itself provided assistance or financial assistance to Greeks of Istanbul, but at a later stage they allowed some provisions. For instance, later the exiles were enabled to benefit from some social support, such as paid military service, in-kind aid, counting the days worked in Turkey as eligible for retirement or admission to universities without examination. In 1964, particularly towards the end of September, because before September, people had the hope of coming back to Istanbul, but by the end of September 64, it became clear that this was mass deportation, and it also became clear that Greek citizens would not be able to come back. Then they started to find out ways of negotiating with the Turkish government, and they established an association called the Society of Exiles. They wanted to formulate some solutions, negotiate with the Turkish government, and they wanted to start a negotiation process between Turkey and Greece for the confiscated properties of Greek citizens of Istanbul. Let me skip those. Another important support mechanism that I'd like to mention is Apelasis newspaper. This was founded by an exiled Greek. It started its publication life as a small brochure. They had some job advertisement, but over time it turned into a newspaper addressing Greeks living in Athens. Istanbul Greeks living in Athens. So on this photo, we see an ad, and the first star is a restaurant called Apelasis. So this was a restaurant initially located in Galata, but later they re-established it in Athens. So here you have the names of restaurants that were previously established and providing services in Istanbul. Another ad about Robert College graduates. Another section about the Greeks who got married or who passed away in Istanbul. So they have the eulogies. The more Istanbul Greeks grew in number, of course, the newspaper expanded the topics it covered.
But there are also people who look for those that they lost, or there are people who are looking for jobs, so it's an important source for that particular period. As a result, it is obvious that the people I interviewed still maintain a strong bond with Istanbul today. They actively contribute in various fields, such as composing music about Istanbul, doing research on its history, doing volunteer work for Greeks, creating works of art such as puppets and dolls depicting life in Istanbul, documenting civil structures on the islands, and organizing the restoration of Greek cemeteries in Istanbul. As one of the people I interviewed stated in a book he gave to me as a gift, the Greeks who don't want to be forgotten because their numbers have decreased so much. Apelasis marks a significant experience in the personal history of the exiles, characterized by adversity and hardship. However, the resilience they show as part of this experience is equally remarkable. The Apelasis narrative is the narrative of the extinction process of the Greeks of Istanbul, but it is also the narrative of the exiled Greeks rebuilding their lives, adapting to new conditions, and preserving their cultural identities, because it's these people who stood against these difficulties. They endured, they held more roots, so they continued their lives, so they expanded their experiences in terms of witnessing, in terms of existing. And the stories of deported Greeks deserve to be recognized and remembered as they continue to shape the narrative of both their own lives and our society. Thank you very much for your patience.